Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the 10-minute Bible lesson. Well, today we're going to be looking at a miracle that Jesus performed, and that was the feeding of the 5,000 plus. And I'll explain that in just a little bit. But before we get into the miracle, there's something that I found that was interesting, is things that happened just before this miracle. In other words, if you could just kind of think about the narrative around this miracle, and it's an amazing an account of the life of Jesus. Now, it all starts when Jesus hears the news about John the Baptist having his head cut off by Herod. Now, John's disciples, after that happened, they took his body and they buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. And that kind of starts the beginnings of leading up to this miracle. So it's all going to be in Matthew chapter 14, and we're going to be looking beginning in verse 13. So let's go ahead and read and see how Jesus responded after he heard the news about John the Baptist. So it says in Matthew 14:13, when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. Now, it's certainly understandable that Jesus, having heard the news about John, that he would want to kind of get away and get to a deserted place. I mean, that makes sense. And there's a little more to that story too, because they were really, really busy. That is, Jesus and his disciples, even before the news came about John. In fact, they were so busy they didn't even have a chance to rest. In fact, the Gospel of Mark tells us that they were so busy, there were so many people coming and going, that they didn't even have time to eat. And so they decided to go to a deserted place. But when they got there, what happened was the multitude had followed them. Now, if it would have been me, if I would have been the person there, I would have been a little bit upset about it, because I'm trying to get away from it all. And I think it's kind of interesting to see what Jesus did, because Jesus never does what we do. That is to say, he always does what's good. So let's read in verse 14. So that would be in Matthew 14:14. So it says, and when Jesus went out, that is when he went out of the boat, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. Now, like I said, if it had been me, I would have told the multitude to go ahead and leave. But that's not how Jesus is. Listen, he was getting away, he and his disciples, to have a place to rest and to get some peace and quiet in a deserted place. And the multitude followed him. And when he got out of the boat, the Bible says this, that he had compassion, that he was moved with compassion upon them. And I thought it was interesting that Mark's account said that he looked upon them as sheep that didn't have a shepherd. And I thought that's just like Jesus to be that way. And there's something else that I noticed in this passage before this miracle takes place of the feeding of the 5,000, that Jesus, it says that Jesus healed their sick. And I never did notice that before. Well, let's go ahead and see how the disciples reacted, and that would be in verses 15 and 16 in Matthew chapter 14. So it says this, when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, this is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the village and buy themselves food. But Jesus answered them, as he does so often in unexpected ways. He said, but Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And I don't know, it was just kind of interesting to me. Now, they wanted to send the multitude away because they were in the deserted place. They wanted them to go into the village and get something to eat. And all of a sudden, I don't think the disciples realized that Jesus was going to asked them to give the people something to eat. I just wondered what they thought about that. In fact, if you read the account in John, it says that Jesus did this to test them because he already knew what he was going to do. So I just thought that was interesting. And another thing I thought might be interesting is what were the feelings and the thoughts of the disciples when all this was happening. I mean, I can't help but think that they were thinking, oh my, can't we just get some peace and quiet? And so let's go ahead and read verses 17 and 18 in Matthew chapter 14. So it says, and they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. He said, bring them to me. So Andrew, in John's gospel, it tells us that there was a young lad there that had, I guess, his lunch, and in his lunch he had 5 loaves and 2 fish. And I think that another thing I thought that was interesting about this is that they told Jesus we just have 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus said an amazing thing. He said, bring them to me. Now why is that so important that he would say, bring them to me? Well, I'm going to just take off on this and say I think that we ought to bring all of our problems to Jesus. And I think that we ought to bring all of our burdens to Jesus. In fact, I think that we ought to bring everything that we're lacking in, and we're lacking in a lot, that we ought to bring it to Jesus. And that's what Jesus said. He said, bring them to me. So let's go ahead and read verse 19 in Matthew chapter 14. So then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. Now I have to ask myself, how did this happen? What in the world did this look like? When this happened, this was an impossibility, that 5 loaves and 2 fish could feed 5,000 men. Now listen, that was just the men, and because it mentions there were women and children there. How many women and children were there? I don't know, but it could have been as many as the men, and if that was the case, there would have been, listen to this, there could have been up to 10,000 people there. And this just amazes me. So how in the world could Jesus do all of that? Here's how he did it. It was a miracle. It was a miracle. In other words, he superseded the natural laws of the universe. And that's what he had to do. So, you know, when the devil was tempting Jesus in the wilderness, he told him, if you're the Son of God, command these stones to be made bread. Could Jesus have done that? Of course he could have done that. But listen, timing is everything. He wasn't going to do what the devil told him to do. In fact, Jesus said this to him. He said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So Jesus, in this miracle, he exercised his creative powers. You see, he created the bread and the fish from nothing. I have to think that he did. You see, he was the creating agent in creating the earth and the universe. And he created those ex nihilo. And what that means is he created them out of nothing. And so what did he do with the bread and fish? I'm thinking that he created the bread and the fish ex nihilo. And what that means, he just made it out of nothing. That he could have done this. He could have just multiplied the molecules and the atoms. He could have done that with the bread and fish. But I think that his creative power, he just made them. So we really don't know. All we know was a magnificent miracle. Well, let's look at the last verse. That's verse 20 in Matthew 14, verse 20. So they all ate and were filled. I love that. Listen, nobody went away hungry. They all got what they wanted and enough. And then it says, listen to this. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. And that's an amazing thing. I don't think these were little bitty baskets. I think they were big baskets, and they were absolutely full. How did that happen? It was absolutely amazing. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about what it takes to make a loaf of bread. Could we just think about that a minute? First, you have to have seed. The seed has to be sown. It has to grow and develop. It has to be harvested. It has to be ground into flour. and then it has to be made into dough, and then it has to be baked. Jesus, he cut through all of that when he created the bread and the fish. And to me, it was an amazing, amazing miracle. Don't you love Jesus? What a great God we have. Well, listen, that's all I have today about the feeding of the 5,000. We appreciate you joining us. We really hope you have a good week.